The next session I'd like to introduce is entitled Regulation Reality. This is a panel discussion, so there will be no presentations. There will be Q&A, plus questions from the floor. I would suggest that what we do is I will throw out the first couple of questions to the panel, and then if anyone has a question, please go up to the mic to either direct a question to the full panel or to individuals on the panel, and then I'll ask the panelists to remain seated just to answer from the table. So this panel will cover existing regulation and the global outlook on forthcoming CCS regulations and the challenges associated with them. And I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished panel. To my right, Dr. Karen Obenshain, Director of Fuels, Technology, and Commercial Policy with the Edison Electric Institute. To my immediate left, Lisa DeMarco, Partner with Norton Rose. And to my furthest left, Milton Caitlin, CEO of the World Coal Association. So just to start off, I'll put the first question to the panel. And the question is regulation required to move CCS forward? So maybe we'll start with Dr. Obenshain, and then we can scoot across. And please, if you have a question, get up. We won't be offended if you don't have a question, but this is your chance to talk to our panelists.
Thank Nick, and thank you for inviting EEI to be here today. I haven't been to Saskatchewan. I've heard about it. In fact, one of my professors in geology was a native of Saskatchewan, and he spent every summer here. Once he retired, he said, "I'm moving back to Saskatchewan." And I heard about a year later, he came back to University of Georgia. He said he forgot how cold it was. But to your question, yes, I think we do need regulations in order to move CCS forward, and we see in the United States the Environmental Protection Agency is moving at a brisk pace forward. It's the only way to help our utilities, who are investor-owned and need to make a profit, to have a reason to do CCS. They have to be able to point to it and say, hey, this is mandated, we need to do it, because it does raise the cost of electricity. If your electricity is higher price, you can't dispatch it. If you can't dispatch it, you're not going to run your plant. It's kind of a vicious circle. So yes, regulation is needed. We just want to have achievable and reasonable regulation. More on that later.
Well, I wouldn't be a good lawyer if I didn't parse the question just a little bit. Is regulation required in the jurisdiction to push CCS forward? What jurisdiction is the question I think I'd parse further. Certainly, regulation is helpful. There's no doubt about that in pushing CCS forward. But what we're seeing right now is that U.S. regulation is in fact facilitating conditions in Canada where there are no nationwide regulations per se, other than the coal-fired power regulations, to push things forward. Certainly at a provincial level, I would say the U.S. regulations currently are having a greater impact than our own coal-fired power regulation. And that is reminiscent of a step change in the industry that is really reminiscent of a social license to operate. The public is demanding some action on climate change, and facilities applications are seeing that in spades. B, the carbon content of power output is becoming far more an element of consideration in power purchase transactions, particularly with the associated cross-border power trading or CO2 emissions trading programs, such as the California AB 32 linking with the Quebec regulation here. And last but not least, in terms of facilities applications, the issue of CO2 content is becoming far more important and a precedent issue throughout. So is regulation necessary? It's helpful. Is regulation in the jurisdiction necessary? Not always.
Thanks for the question. I suppose from the World Coal Association's point of view, we come to this issue saying, yes, regulation can be helpful, and it comes down to the specific types of regulation. Regulation can be helpful if it can explain to people the costs of electricity. One of the speakers earlier today talked about the lack of literacy on energy and climate matters in the general public. And I think that's something we find in whatever country we go to. So if regulation can help to explain why electricity costs what it does, why clean electricity will be a more expensive form, then that's helpful. Regulation is also helpful in terms of public acceptance. It provides the public some surety that public officials, that politicians are looking after their interests, that there are procedures in place for things like long-term liability. But I think the general point I'd make about regulation is that the Europeans, in particular, seem to approach regulation and seem to approach the issue of CCS in a different way to North Americans and perhaps others around the globe. To Europeans, they see CCS in terms of threats, which must be ameliorated, reduced, or eliminated through legislation and through regulation. But I think to North Americans, and particularly, obviously, people in Saskatchewan, they see CCS in terms of opportunities. There are certainly bad examples of regulation around the world. You look at the EU emissions trading scheme, and you have to say, I can't identify how that scheme, how that set of regulations has helped the development or deployment of CCS. And I would also argue, as Lisa has simply stated before me, that the US regulations do nothing to promote or accelerate the deployment of CCS. They certainly accelerate fuel switching from coal to gas, which is entirely understandable in a country that finds itself lately a gas giant.
And maybe as a follow-up, and I'd also like to tell the panelists that if you'd like to add to what one of your colleagues have said, feel free to chime in. But Milton, as a follow-up to you, you talked about the European view that they see it as a threat. And we also heard about jurisdictions that are leaders, but why don't we set those things aside and say, is there anybody getting it right? Is there a jurisdiction out there that you would look to say, maybe it's not a leading jurisdiction, but they're doing some things that are right? And if any of the other panelists have something to contribute on that front. So, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to say that if a jurisdiction gets CCS up, it's difficult to say it's because of regulation or because of other factors. And it's also difficult to suggest that those factors be duplicated or replicated in other countries. I mean, if China gets a CCS power plant up in the next couple of years, I suspect the factors involved in that and the sort of regulation and the state, the involvement of the state in performance by instrumentalities is something that can't be replicated in other countries. On Europe, I think many people in this room, it was a theme, I think, of the speakers this morning, that many of the speakers this morning mentioned, well, if you'd told me a few years ago I'd be in Regina talking about CCS, I would have said, no, it's going to happen in Norway or it's going to happen in Europe or something. I think the big question is, how has Europe missed the train? Just this morning I got a tweet from a member of the European Parliament who has a picture of Boundary Dam and is sending it out to her followers saying, where have we gone wrong? Where has Europe lost the plot? Boundary Dam opened this week for business and Europe nowhere to be seen. It's useful to look at some of the figures. Of the 19 projects at various stages of planning in 2010 in the EU, 12 have been cancelled or put on hold, 6 haven't progressed through a development gateway in nearly 4 years, and none has commenced construction, let alone operation. And I think the difference does come back to perhaps the cultural differences between Europe and North America, between Canada and Europe, between Saskatchewan and Europe. I think Europeans too view, well, if I step back a bit, for CCS to work, it's important for 2 preconditions. One is that people and governments and decision makers understand that fossil fuels are going to be part of the energy system, whether you like it or not, for the foreseeable future. And secondly, you need to understand, appreciate and act upon the idea that climate change is real. Well, I think for Europeans, the second condition is much easier to accept. Europeans, by and large, accept almost as part of a litany that climate change is real. but they don't accept that fossil fuels will be around. And I think that's the European experience. But if you look at the globe's experience, coal alone, 40% of the world's electricity. 25 years' time, with all the actions inherent in the Kyoto Protocol, etc., it'll still be 40% of the world's electricity. You look, and Europeans tend to say, well, this is China. It's China's fault. They're building a power plant every week, etc. Half of all the coal-fired power plants on the books today are in India. Now, are you going to say that India doesn't deserve economic development, doesn't deserve affordable fuel, and are you going to say that to them as a continent which has grown on fossil fuels itself? If you look at, sorry, I'll go too far down that track, but I do think Europeans look at CCS as a threat. They look at regulation as a way of containing threats, and they mistake action on climate change for support for renewables. If you talk to the average guy in the street in London or Brussels or Paris, he is convinced that the Kyoto Protocol on climate change primary objective is promote renewables, and it's not.
Yeah, just briefly to add to Milton, unabashedly, I will say that Saskatchewan is a jurisdiction that's doing it right, and doing it right from a number of perspectives. First, it makes sense in the context of Canadian federalism, which respects provincial jurisdiction over electricity and federal jurisdiction over broader, shared jurisdiction over the broader environment. CCS made sense in Saskatchewan, even in the absence of regulation, where real leadership was shown to make the kinds of decisions that went into the go-forward determination. Secondly, the innovation basis wasn't lost on the province. They understood that they were doing something novel, that they were being creative, and they were forwarding an economy that needed a boost to really respond to an overarching trend that wasn't going away. Decarbonization is a rule, is a fact. Whether or not you believe in climate change, it's something to accept at this point. Third, phenomenal outreach on the local stakeholder and First Nations front. I have never seen a more successful stakeholder implementation plan that had more local people on board early on and continued to consult them as part of the project. We don't see that really in the US, in Europe, and other jurisdictions within the country. We don't see that sort of local stakeholder support. So whatever was done, just package that, manufacture it as pixie dust and sell it to the rest of the world. Last but certainly not least is, I think, the fact that they picked an existing asset and refurbished. Brilliant. No new land developments and greenfield site issues. Secondly, in terms of the broader application around the world, let's face it, we're not going to strand how many billions of dollars of coal-fired assets in the necessary move to real action on climate change. So to the extent that they've picked an existing asset, refurbished it, retrofitted as CCS, really, really smart, both in terms of the applicability, and secondly, it's very rare that we actually get to push US law, but we've effectively redefined BATIA, the best available technology, economically achievable. Saskatchewan effectively has moved the needle on the US policy front in terms of what is and is not feasible. So if I had to pick an underdog leader who's doing it right, certainly I'd pick Saskatchewan.
At least as a follow-up, when you just talked about Canada's regulations in terms of their impact in other countries, so you believe it could be a model? I think Milton was like, this is a tough nut to crack in terms of trying to have a model that's applicable, but you sound a little more positive?
I think certainly, again, you have to go to the local circumstances to determine whether it's a successful model, but in terms of using it as a criteria for assessing what is a go project, what is not, absolutely it could be a model. looking at that accepting stakeholder population, an existing climate change regulatory scheme, whether that's direct or indirect from another jurisdiction, looking at a clear system for allocating and managing larger costs and long-term liabilities, looking at a system that actually values the lower emission intensity of the power that is the output of the facility. You can do that a million ways. We're not tied to any specific method of carbon pricing and or cap and trade. It's just simply a system that values, either by labeling and or by some form of carbon pricing or cap and trade scheme, the output of the power resulting from a CCS plant being lower emission intensity, and in this case, 1/3 to 1/4 of the output of natural gas power plants of comparable CCGT emissions portfolio. Certainly, I think that's the competitor in the room here. With the amount of gas on the system and the fines, certainly we see that CCS is not competing against unregulated coal. It's not competing against nuclear. It's competing against gas-fired CCGT. So to the extent that you can put those figures out front and center, you oughta.
Thank you. So you mentioned the U.S., and I'd like to ask a question to Dr. Obenshain. What can we expect in the immediate and short term for the U.S. with regulation? What would you say are the key points of debate in the U.S.?
That was an easy question you just gave me. No. As you know, EPA has proposed three different rules for CO2 emissions from the power sector. One is for new plants, both coal and gas. The second is for existing plants, coal, gas, and it looks like oil got grouped into that also. And another is what happens if you modify or reconstruct an existing plant. On the new plants, I'm afraid that the result of that rule, which has not been finalized, will be, because it requires partial carbon capture with a standard of 1,100 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour on coal, we will not be building any new coal anytime soon. That's not just because of that rule, it's because of the market. Natural gas is cheap. Our energy demand is flat to declining, so we really have no reason to build anything new. If we do need something, we're building gas. With the existing proposal, which we are working on comments now, thank goodness we got an extension until December 1st. Otherwise, I would be having a panic attack because comments would be due October 16th. Again, CCS does not factor into the existing power plant rule. EPA says, well, you could use it if you wanted to, but remember, in the U.S., especially in the investor-owned utilities, we sell electricity into a market. What gets dispatched, what gets bought by that market is the cheapest stuff first. The cheapest stuff is based on marginal costs, which kind of translates to fuel costs, and so your wind and your solar and nukes get dispatched first, then gas and coal kind of battle it out, and as demand goes up, your oil units come on. If we have to put on CCS for a new plant, it's doubtful we'll be able to dispatch that plant. So unfortunately, I'm afraid the new source rule kind of put a damper on building new coal. But then again, no new coal plant's been announced since 2010.
I have a follow-up for you, and it kind of builds on what Milton had talked about in terms of what I'll say the reality of coal, right, the long-term reality of coal. As a follow-up, and this is the tougher question, so how do we reconcile good politics and good public policy? Because it seems that there are people that think that good politics is to give coal a kick, right? But we look at the numbers in terms of long-term demand and what's required in terms of the economy, that good public policy might not reconcile with that. So can that circle be squared?
All these easy questions today.
There you go. Well, I'm just an easy moderator.
That's a really good question. On the politics with this administration, there seems to be a bit of, let's get rid of coal. And that doesn't jive with what we see in our diverse energy structure we have. 40% of our electricity comes from coal in the United States, and it's expected to be around 40% for years to come. We're not sure what incentives are out there that are going to help to move coal forward. If natural gas prices shoot up tremendously, back up to $14 BCF, then yeah, we might be building more coal. And who knows, we might even build it with carbon capture. It depends on, we have one unit in the United States that's under construction, that's a full-scale integrated power plant, and that's Mississippi Power, their IGCC with carbon capture. It's a very expensive plant. Southern Company will tell you it's not really a model for any other place because of the unique circumstances of financing. So it'll just be interesting to see what happens in politics and in public policy.
And will there be any difference depending on the change, if there's a change in administration, do you think?
No, I don't think so, because a lot of what we see is market-driven.
And go ahead, Milton, go for it.
Yeah, can I say this is Chatham House rule, right?
Don't tweet this. That's what Milton has just said.
The U.S. administration is practicing a massive con. Really a massive con. I mean, you know, and you'd be making the same actions yourself if you were in power in the United States. If you found yourself flooded with cheap gas, of course you use cheap gas. Helps your industry, helps households, helps taxpayers, helps politicians get taxpayers off their backs. But the con is in saying that switching to gas addresses climate change. That, you know, all the science tells you. You know, a few years ago, what was it they said, the IPCC said or the IEA said, to keep below 2 degrees this century, you would need to be building a whole lot of infrastructure. You would need to be building 35 coal plants with CCS every year. But it also said at the same time, you need to be building 20 gas-fired power plants with CCS. You need to be putting on a fifth of Canada's hydro capacity every year. You need to be building 17,000 wind turbines every year. Now, the US has digested all that, or the administration has digested that and said, oh, we'll switch to gas. Well, that's not the same thing. Gas is going to need CCS as much as coal is going to need CCS. So I find it a bizarre con by the US administration to say that switching to gas is something to do with climate change. And I'm a bit disappointed, I must say, at companies like Saudi Aramco in New York last week at the climate change meetings saying, oh, we're not the problem, the real problem is coal. Well, you know, for a major pusher of gas to say coal is the problem, I can understand from a commercial point of view, but it doesn't make sense if you're worried about the environment.
Just briefly, and I'll apologize, I have to run out to catch a plane. It's funny that the two aren't antithetical. And I think, if I can say we, including yours truly, have done a very poor job at letting spin interfere with facts. So the more we can put the numbers out there, literally, 420 kilograms per megawatt hour for good CCGT, maybe 375 for great CCGT, versus 130 kilograms per megawatt hour for CCS coal. Do a life cycle assessment. Put all the numbers out there and start using the facts to persuasively convince the public of, if you want 2 degrees at such and such a cost, here's what it is. If you want jobs, because certainly in the context of the US, we are talking about a very strong labor protectionist move to facilitate the ongoing development of the gas industry and keep those jobs domestically. Put it on the table and argue it apples to apples, as opposed to emotionally, coal bad, gas good, renewables better. Put the numbers on the table. So I have an expression that I regularly use in dealing with policymakers, and that's, ditch your dogma at the door. Start dealing with the facts at hand, and if we really are solving for X problem, let's look at X. If we're solving for a jobs problem, let's look at jobs. If we're solving for emissions, let's look at emissions. If we're solving for lowest cost power, let's look at all of those.
Great. I understand we have a question, so we will take a question from the floor, and then we will wrap up.
Hi there. Alfredo Ramos, Process Systems Enterprise in London. I had a question to you, Lisa. You suggested that it would be a good idea to export the Saskatchewan mall worldwide. Sorry. You suggested it would be a good idea to export the mall in Saskatchewan to worldwide, EU, for example. Now, let's say the methodology that we have in there to make CCS viable looks a bit of having a bit of a stick and also a carrot. Where the stick is obviously carbon taxes, efficiency, targets, and then the carrot could be, for example, here in Saskatchewan, will be mostly something like EOR, where you can actually sell your CO2. Now, what do you think that Europe should do, where EOR is not such a, common practice at the moment, especially in the North Sea? Because there's, if you think about it, on the generator side, with CFDs, we do have a mechanism to reward this behavior. But on the other hand, especially on the storage provider side, there's a bit of a gap. There's nothing that encourages people to look into new storage possibilities and take on the huge financial risk that they faced at the beginning. And it's very difficult to negotiate in that situation and obtain the required finance.
Certainly the context, again, is very important, and the European context right now might be slightly different, but I'm encouraged by some of the technology developments that are going on here, and very specifically the finding that the purity of the CO2 coming out of the Boundary Dam 3 project is effectively food grade. So looking at alternate uses, looking at alternate abilities to effectively treat the end product, I think would be very interesting. And looking at it in the geopolitical context that you have right now in Europe, specifically the Russian context and the 30-year negotiated agreement between Russia and China, is very important. I think energy security is the context you have to play there, and in particular, looking at that as an external stick is probably quite different than we feel here in the North American context. So I would certainly push that.
Good, thank you. Well, that's going to wrap up this panel. This panel was a straight talk, question and A kind of session. So I'd like to, on behalf of everyone here, thank all of our panelists.